Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 5th, 2025. So we are inaugurating our Salon series for 2025 now. We have reached the end of the first quarter century of the third millennium. So it is later than you think, ladies and gentlemen. And joining us today, we have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Publication, Zach Richardson, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our member from Texas who leads the Texas Transhumanist Party, Alan Crowley, and our special guests for today, returning to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon, are Andreas Melhede and Namkhai Ferdaña of Elata Biosciences. Now, Elata Biosciences used to be called HappyDAO, and we actually held a Virtual Enlightenment Salon with HappyDAO on June 9th, 2024. So it has been almost 7 months, but a lot has happened at Elata Biosciences since then. So Andreas and Namkhai, welcome, and please let us know, how have the approach and areas of focus of Elata Biosciences evolved since our previous salon, and what is new?
Yeah, thank you for having us on, Kennedy. Appreciate that.
Yes, indeed.
So how I would answer that is we've really done a deep dive into the industry. We've talked to a ton of key opinion leaders, and we have essentially tried our very hardest to get behind what the specific bottlenecks in psychiatry are as a way of sort of refining our strategy. What we found is that it's so prone to failure, everything in psychiatry, because the patient populations during clinical trials, they're so heterogeneous. So essentially every patient looks completely different. If you enroll a trial with major depression, every single person could look completely different. So the main thing that we're focused on now is really separating that and trying to build out better sub portions of people to make it more homogeneous, so you have more predictable treatment outcomes. I think that's probably the main thing, if I could just put it in a somewhat succinct way.
Yeah, I also just want to thank you also for the opportunity to talk with you guys again. It's always a pleasure to have conversations here, and I think we always get into some really interesting topics, and we had to really evaluate our approach in different ways that is quite helpful for us to move forward in a better way following these conversations. And yeah, like I think Namkhai covered pretty well why there's been a bit of a shift, and also I would just say in terms of the name, where we were thinking that our biggest goal is to get the best science possible into DeSci and into the project, and we think the name is essential to kind of get to that. So we're thinking that Elata Biosciences sounds more interesting to a scientist that doesn't know anything about DeSci or the project than being called HappyDAO. So we think it's more professional, and there's no need to be called a DAO per se in the name for it to be a DAO organizational wise. So that's kind of, I would say, why we chose to change the name to that.
Yes, thank you very much for that explanation. And I was curious about the name change, but it is true that DeSci is new to a lot of people, including to a lot of scientists, and perhaps, let's say, a more gradual introduction to that concept would occur as they get involved with Elata Biosciences. But I'm also curious about Namkhai's comments about the distinct patient subpopulations and how a lot of the conditions that go by the same names, like depression, really manifest differently in different individuals. And that is certainly the case. I know in our previous discussion, when you were still called HappyDAO, you were discussing pharmaceutical approaches that would essentially work and that would take into account the distinct individual differences. So I'm curious at this stage what more precise pharmaceutical approaches for various mental health conditions is Elata Biosciences considering, and how would they be custom tailored to these different patient subpopulations?
Yeah, so I think that when you look at something like depression, there's really just so many different types of depression and ways it manifests. So you could be someone who has depression and maybe you have a comorbidity with cognitive impairment. Maybe you are someone with, for a lack of a better term, with psychomotor retardation. It's hard to get up in the morning. It's hard to be energized. The pharmaceutical side, it's very tricky. It's very complicated. We do have a few things that we're playing with right now. But yeah, I would say for the most part, it just comes down to the differences in between each patient and really trying to address those in the most granular way possible. And when it comes to drugs, there is a new emphasis being put on new drug targets. So right now, and sort of just to like zoom out for a second, is the industry is very broadly focused on psychedelics, on ketamine. The reason that they're focused on these drugs so much is because they're what's known as psychoplastogens. So they rapidly induce a neurogenesis process that that can help lead to rapid recovery. It's somewhat similar to what we see in SSRIs, but on a much more expedited timeline. The way that this has been done traditionally has used a couple of different targets, monoamines, so serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. But we're really starting to see a shift now where people are going outside of that. And I think especially following the approval of two drugs, one of which is ketamine a few years back, as well as a drug called brexanolone, which is it's a GABAergic drug. We've really seen a shift away from that. And we're personally very excited about that, because when you just go for the monoamines, I think history will show us that there's some issues with doing that and there's some complexity behind that.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I'm curious also, when do you think truly personalized pharmaceuticals will arrive? Of course, there has been discussion in approximately the past decade and a half of personalized medicine being the future, where people, instead of being prescribed a one-size-fits-all kind of treatment, like being prescribed an SSRI for a wide spectrum of conditions, could have a set of approaches that is tailored for them based on not just some generic label, but much more information about their physiology, their medical history, how their organism works. How far away do you think we are from that world where if a person has a particular condition, instead of just a doctor saying, well, you have condition X, so I'll prescribe Y because that's what I prescribe to people with condition X, the doctor will instead say, well, you have something under the broad label of X, but here are your specific characteristics that relate to that, and I'm going to custom design a regimen, which could even include a customized compound where even the dosage is specific to you, to your organism and what it needs.
So I can't speak too much for other areas of medicine, but I think in terms of psychiatry, it'll be a very nonlinear process. Just in the past few years, there have been countless initiatives popped up that are specifically focused on precision psychiatry. The three main ones that me and Andreas we've spoken to folks associated with these initiatives, and the three main ones are Stanford, MassGen, which is Harvard, and Columbia. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to marry basic research to clinical data, because one of the main issues in psychiatry, which I can touch on a little bit, is the animal models. It's very difficult to understand how well something works in the preclinical phases, because psychiatry heavily relies on clinical observations. So essentially what you're seeing in the patient with human participants. So it makes the translational process extremely challenging. And that's what these initiatives are trying to solve. They're trying to marry what's happening in the brain to what is observed in the clinic to create a much more predictable treatment response. In terms of like an exact timeline, I don't think anyone really knows, but we are seeing a much more sturdy effort in this area. Traditionally, pharma has just completely divested from neuropsychiatry because of how challenging it's been. And I think that this will sort of start to shift that. And the further we go into the rabbit hole here as an industry, I think the more progress we'll see there. And I think we're closer than a lot of people think. A lot of people think it's pretty far out. I think it's closer than a lot of people think.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that we have talked with some of the top people in psychiatry regarding these different ideas and the issues, and they also, I think they're very excited about the potential of such an organization that we're trying to build, and they see a huge need. So I think it's right now. Big pharma, they are afraid of taking that initial risk because it still has been historically very risky to go into psychiatry. But with this new approach of precision psychiatry, using precision medicine for psychiatry, we believe that there's a shift there, and there's great demand for it. So we hope that we can be a part of trying to get more interest into the industry, and hopefully get more big organizations to also invest and develop these treatments, because we're seeing these skyrocketing rates, but there's not really much emphasis on actually trying to find new ways to solve these treatments that haven't been developed much in the last many years. So I think we are in a time now where we can hopefully see some big changes in the coming years or decades.
Yes, thank you. And I do hope that those changes happen and that they happen sooner rather than later. We have some interesting comments in our chat. Mike Lazine points out that a person can be autistic or have bipolar disorder type 1 or 2, and that could actually lead a person to be more likely to be depressed, and perhaps depression arising from those conditions may be different in how it manifests or how it needs to be treated from depression in other patients. So that's a point that is well taken. Daniel Tweed writes, it's kind of cool that hearing the organization's name spoken as Elata Biosciences can sound like Elata Biosciences. So thank you, Dan, for that amusing observation. And Mike Lazine was thinking the same thing. So I suppose great minds think alike. And John H. writes, and I think this is worthwhile to discuss further, I think we're as far away as our comprehensive understanding of the functioning of the human intelligence system, brain, nervous system, gut microbiome, etc. may be. And Zach Richardson agrees that this is essentially a system of interrelated parts. He writes, there are so many feedback loops. So that could pose some challenges. Zach, perhaps you would like to elaborate on those comments and your understanding of the feedback loops.
Yeah, so my sort of thought on one of them is just like, and I think this is a little bit resolved now in current usage, but it was using benzodiazepines to be able to treat anxiety, in that it does work and it immediately relaxes you. But when you're not dealing with the issues that are causing you the anxiety, some back part of your brain is still going, wait, you should still be anxious, and like making them less effective, which is why they're not prescribed for long-term use. Another thing I'm interested in is particularly was mentioned the gut microbiome, how that deals with, I think, some huge percentage of serotonin that's in our system. And a lot of people can interfere with it by eating or drinking the wrong things. And there are now tailored probiotics that one can take, such as Akkermansia, that end up in working as a system with the gut microbiome to be able to help preserve the innards of it. So, for example, Akkermansia, it really helps make your gut lining a lot more strong, which kind of helps the issue as a system, because you don't have stuff leaking out into your system. Since leaky gut is, as I understand, sort of like a scale. So you have one thing that's really strengthening that, then the whole system is working better and continue to grow. There's also some disgusting therapies called fecal transplants, which are exactly what it sounds like, but have shown to be apparently pretty effective as like the quickest way to actually permanently change your gut microbiome, rather than the temporary supplementing with probiotics, which seems to like go away after a while. And I don't think we understand the reason why for that. But I had sort of a question, as being someone that's in our Discord server. We recently set a feedback loop for a couple of DAOs to have their announcements published to our blockchain and e-governance channel. And one of them I picked was CryoDAO, but I'm interested in, like, as an overview for anyone's here or who's watching, can you give like at a high level explanation of what a DAO is? And also, do you explicitly still say to anybody interested in the Elata Biosciences, oh, by the way, this is a DAO? And also, what are their like reactions to that? Because my sort of sense is some people end up going, oh, that's like cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin. Am I going to get scammed? And like, what's the relation?
Yeah, I think it's a very good and important question, because it's very important that we tailor these things to the people we're talking to, of course. And if people don't know anything about crypto, very little, and they just heard something about the news of someone getting scammed through a token or their family members or something, of course, that could be an issue. And we usually don't mention much of the crypto aspects initially. We talk more about kind of the foundational structure of the organization. And so for me, I've always kind of thought about a DAO as kind of a democratic way of running an organization, where you have the tokens basically being as votes, where anyone are able to have a say in what's happening and not happening within the DAO, are able to propose. And also, I think a really important thing also, which I would say is not always emphasized enough within DAOs, but is the community aspect. I think it's, if you're able to reward, listen to, and just collaborate with the community, I think you're able to achieve like much better things. And I think that's one of the strongest points of a DAO, that you're able to actually be aligned with directly with patients and researchers that actually have these needs. So whereas normally in a traditional organization, you have it more closed off, and then you have maybe some month you hear you don't hear anything at all, and then suddenly there's an announcement, and you have no idea how it happened, or like kind of if it's good or bad, or kind of what the reasoning is behind it. Like there is some public information sometimes, but it's not always so clear as why. So I think here with the DAO, you have this kind of constant flow of voting and collaboration, transparency, and communication just with the community. And so for me, I think like that's some of the strongest points of a DAO, and we're definitely still a DAO. We're just not called DAO, as mentioned, to kind of try to tailor it more to scientists, because our biggest emphasis is creating the best possible science, and we want to figure out how to track those in the best way possible. And I think having DAO in the name is not really helping with that. If anything, I think it's making it harder to attract scientists. It doesn't have to, but I don't think it's helping anything. It either be neutral or make it worse, I would say. So I think it's kind of my answer to that question, but I think it's a good one.
So you talk about votes being distributed, and I think it's really cool. I've always said, like, democracy is neat, but it seems clear to me that some people should have like more votes on things than other people. If you have, you're voting on something to deal with health, why would you have a guy laying in the street that doesn't do much with his life for his own reasons or whatever, versus like a doctor that's really knowledgeable on this? Why would they be able to have equal votes on something? But that brings up the question, how are these votes distributed? I understand that they're like tokens, but are they portioned? Is it just through purchase of the tokens that people acquire these votes to be able to influence decision making in the Elata Biosciences, which is technically a DAO, but we don't say it that way?
Yeah. So as mentioned, like the community aspect is quite important within our emphasis of a DAO and organization. So I think for us to distribute control is very important. It's also why our tokenomics is very much distributed to the community, and to anyone to be able to actually come in and participate and have some governance tokens. And people can of course they can buy the token, but they can also earn it from either contributing like as a member of the DAO and doing some work for the DAO, and also we're also going to distribute some to like help community members, and there are going to be some different initiatives there where they can earn some by maybe helping with a specific thing. Could also be a referral, for instance, for a research project, stuff like that. So like we actually have 16% of our tokens allocated to community rewards. So and I think again it kind of is highlighting how like for me, I think one of the strongest points with DAO is really to be community aligned and really like reward them for supporting us and be aligned with us and like discuss with them and grow with them. So I think for us it's a huge aspect, and we want to be for anyone to be able to actually become part of the DAO and have their say in what they think we should do and not do and discuss with them directly. I think that's very, very important.
I'm interested in this particularly because I started watching your guys' first Enlightenment Salon to be able to prepare for this. And within about 10 minutes, I was enraged and ready to fight you guys after hearing the Emperor's New Drugs. I thought the science, and I did not like the science in that. It seemed to imply that we should look at things as averages to be able to tell if a certain molecule had a particular effect on a person, or else that there was something in there about how if a person knows they're having the effect from a drug, then it influences their mind and could be a placebo effect. And I thought that was so funny because as someone who takes Wellbutrin, one of your naughty molecules, it very clearly increases epinephrine, dopamine. You feel more positive, more goal-oriented. So the argument would be from this guy, Irving, would be that because I feel more happy and goal-oriented, I could know that I took a pill and therefore be influenced in my ability to have someone rate or believe whether I'm having an effect on the drug. And that same sort of use of placebo effect was noted in the MDMA trials that MAPS put out. I think the FDA said something in their analysis when they said we need more research, or they denied the approval of MDMA. They said, well, we can't blind the placebo group. So it's like, because the person takes it and they get really happy, They know that took the drug, so therefore we can't trust whether they're happy or not. But as I went through, I really appreciated what you guys were talking about, tailoring solutions to individual people, because I think looking at some of the science, some of these molecules have a very strong effect that are positive on people. Like for me, I'll just say it, I love Wellbutrin. It's great, but I can understand for some other people, it gets them a little edgy and a little anxiety. So I can imagine that being negative, but it's really cool what you guys are doing.
I think that just conceptually, Wellbutrin's really interesting because not a lot of people know this, but the original use case for it was for seasonal affective disorder. That was the original approval that it got. I think sort of just, zooming out a little bit and thinking about it conceptually, that sort of stuff is going to be really cool and big in the future, where we sort of see things with different use cases on a very sort of niche level. Like I don't want to divert from the science too much, but it is psychiatry, right? So I feel like if you were to ask patients who are on maybe like Lexapro versus Wellbutrin, their anecdotes would be completely different as to what the subjective effects are like.
Yes. Thank you for that discussion. And for those who are interested in the conversation that Zach mentioned, do watch the June 9th, 2024 Virtual Enlightenment Salon with what was then HappyDAO. And yes, a large focus of the conversation there was how to develop drugs and treatments that are more personalized toward each patient based on their own needs. And also, Zach mentioned our virtual Enlightenment Salon with CryoDAO with Kai Micah Mills, which took place on September 1st, 2024. And Kai is a good friend of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. We've had him as a guest for 3 virtual Enlightenment Salons. So please check out the one on CryoDAO and the others as well. Now, Alan Crowley has a question that I think is relevant to the conversation that has transpired. He wonders, where are we on the designer drug market? It seems like the process is possible for an individual with lots of resources, but where does that market become scalable?
In terms of personalized treatments, is that what I understand?
Yes.
Okay. I think that, well, with regards to psychiatry, I assume that's what the question is about. We are definitely on an interesting path, and I wanted to mention this the last time around, but I think this is really where DeSci comes in, is funding the development of these things. So in the last 3 months, we've seen a couple key drugs fail in psychiatry. One of them just last week was a drug from Neumora. It was a monotherapy. So it was an opioid. It was a kappa opioid receptor drug. They recently just failed. I believe it was their first phase 3 readout. So there's a lot of skepticism now from Wall Street. You mentioned the microbiome. That's also another area where there's really a lot of skepticism, just due to past failures and past events in that space. I think that we're definitely making progress in psychiatry, but the more of these things fail, which is, inevitable, the more we're going to see that impetus close. That's where I think DeSci comes in, is we can really accelerate the development of these designer drugs and these personalized therapeutics.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And that leads me to another question that I wanted your input on. What do you think are some of the most ambitious and promising projects in DeSci today? The kinds of projects that could lead to a lot of public attention on decentralized science approaches and lead people to say, well, this is promising, this is leading somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think ultimately the key inflection point here regarding the science is a drug or a treatment reaching clinical trials, and there's actually a new DAO being launched, I think this month, called Curetopia, uh, which is focused on rare diseases, and it's led by a guy called Ethan Prostine that has a lot of experience in biotech and has done really well on this other organization that I think he's kind of integrating that into the new DAO, where he's focusing a lot on repurposing drugs from China and other places and using those for these rare diseases, and I've seen some really promising results. I remember I was at DeSci Berlin last year, and he actually did a presentation about one of the treatments that he repurposed there, and I don't remember the condition exactly, but he showed where there was a kid that I think could barely move and barely walk, um, and then this kid, I think she was 8 years old or something. She got this treatment, and then after just I think a few weeks, she was actually able to walk a bit, and it constantly improved over weeks and months. And she's not working perfectly, but she's able to move now, and she's actually able to like do so much better than she was in the beginning. And overall, like he's had some really good successes in biotech and has a lot of connections there. And I think he really knows what he's doing, and I think he has a lot of promise in him getting something to clinical trials probably pretty soon. So I think that's very promising. Regarding other organizations, I think there are many good ones out there, and it's hard to know how fast everything moves. But ultimately, I think that's a very interesting one that I'm definitely interested in, and I also I'm talking to Ethan once in a while about how things are going, and I think it's very worthwhile following an approach like that, and I think we really need to get some treatments to that stage in clinical trials to really showcase how promising DeSci can be, and of course, like getting a one to market would be even more promising. It would take longer, but I think those are probably the key inflection points to really showcase scientists that DeSci can really produce amazing science, which it definitely can. It's just about showcasing that. And I think also a lot of it is if you have a really good scientist, they have a lot of reputation and they're afraid of risking that and going to something new that seems a bit different, and maybe there's a lot of skeptics. So I think once we see those inflection points, it's going to be much easier to really get the best scientists involved.
Yes, and I do think some visible success in either getting a successful clinical trial completed or getting patients cured of rare diseases would be quite important for the public visibility of decentralized science as well as public acceptance. But those who want to check out Curetopia can do so at curetopia.xyz, and this does seem like a promising approach when it comes to low-hanging fruit, because if existing drugs can be repurposed to successfully treat or cure, hopefully, some rare diseases, that could generate headlines. And I know a lot of rare diseases are understudied and definitely have insufficient resources devoted toward them. There are many so-called orphan diseases which don't have any drugs or treatments that have been approved for them at present because Big Pharma doesn't have enough of an incentive to address them, but maybe a DAO will. So thank you very much for that. And Zach points out that is the essence of transhumanism, using science to overcome human limitations. And I would certainly agree with that statement. Now, I'm also curious with regard to both Elata Biosciences in particular, and more generally in DeSci type organizations that you know of, how are blockchain technologies being utilized to decide on which research pathways are most promising? And we did talk a bit about decision making and who should be involved in the decision making, and Zach pointed out, it shouldn't just be a random guy lying on the street. John H. points out, what if the guy lying on the street has an IQ of 185 and dropped out of Harvard Med School after suffering a cluster of personal disasters? So there could be exceptions to that, noted. But in our last salon, we did discuss different governance approaches, such as quadratic voting or reputation-based voting, and how a balance can be struck between pure democracy and completely centralized decision making. So what are your current thoughts on this, and what approaches are you observing, and how do blockchain technologies play into those?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and broad questions. There are many different things can be discussed there. I would say currently some of the most promising things that are being done is trying to distribute the control and utility of health data, where you are anonymizing people's data, as for instance, using these CK sync proofs, where people don't actually are able to see who it is and able to distribute it to different researchers. There are some few organizations that are coming up. I'm trying to build that out. For instance, Wilshire Health, they launched a few months ago, and they're focused on diabetes initially, patients, and trying to get data for new treatments. And yeah, besides that, as we discussed with there's the tokens that function as as a governance mechanism, and then there's also the interesting aspect of putting IP on chain, where you're putting into an NFT, and then that you're able to make that more easier to trade in between organizations and people, and distribute control and governance of that. There is some legal things that makes it a little bit difficult regarding some ownership aspects of that, especially distributing control of that. So that's why you have currently is the current emphasis of, you have the IP NFT, which is the IP you put into an NFT, and then that is usually owned by an external organization that's governed by a DAO, and then there is, from that, people are fractionalizing that into what they call IPT, so IP tokens, so kind of like distributing the control there. But here, because of legal security risks, you're only able to actually issue governance rights over those tokens. So you're actually, the people that are owning those tokens are actually not owning the IP per se, but they're able to vote on, for instance, if it gets to be a successful treatment, they can vote on distributing proceeds from that in the end. So in a way, you could say that it can function a bit similarly, but I think being able to actually distribute ownership could be an even more interesting aspect, and hopefully that can be possible legally sometime in the future. But already, I think those are some quite interesting aspects of blockchain. I think there's a lot of promise even at this current stage and with the current legislation.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. And the concept of an IP token or an IP NFT is actually one that we did discuss to a significant extent with Eleanor Davies back when she was with VitaDAO on September 3rd, 2023. So those who are interested in that can watch that salon. I understand that she has moved on to another DAO called Cerebrum DAO, and hopefully at some point we'll have an update on their endeavors. One of the questions that I had for her at that salon was in terms of IP NFTs and essentially fractional ownership of intellectual property. How does that perhaps apply, or how does that maybe even pose certain issues in situations where a decision has to be made on how certain intellectual property gets utilized, like in situations where somebody else might want to leverage that IP, And if you have one IP holder, then it's pretty clear who gets to make that decision. And perhaps that entity could be persuaded either for payment or because there's a humanitarian motive to let that IP be used. But if it's split up among multiple holders, this reminds me in some cases of mortgage-backed securities, where instead of having just a single entity owning a mortgage, you now have multiple fractional investors, and those investors, for instance, might not be as flexible because they want their return. Whereas if you have a person experiencing hardship with a mortgage, the bank, if the bank fully owns that mortgage, might exercise some forbearance. The fractional investors who each want their income stream might not be so understanding. So with IP NFTs, could there be a situation where some fractional owner might decide, I just want my income stream. I don't really care about other applications of this IP, whereas a more consolidated owner might be a bit more reachable, a bit more persuadable.
Yeah, so I think of course, like there's always going to be potentials for both. Like it's kind of impossible to avoid either of those, I think. So the thing with so as I tried to allude to before, is that the IP NFT is owned. So it's kind of right now you have, for instance, let's say HappyDAO, they own IP NFT, and then if they create IPTs, that's then functioning as governance over that IP NFT. So in essence, like the token holders of the IPTs, they would then decide what would happen with that IP NFT. But it tends to be the case where the organization owning the IP NFT, they have a significant ownership over the IPTs. So that means that if some misaligned people come in and they try to buy up all the IPTs, they still have a significant amount of ownership. So it usually shouldn't really be an issue of having misaligned individuals coming in. And so that's what I've seen so far. Like, of course, it depends on how you distribute the control of that and how aligned the people are, of course. And I think it's also why you should really focus on trying to align everything you're doing with the community and really have them kind of empowered to support and believe in the mission. And if they are incentivized and supportive and understand the need of what you're trying to do, I think it's going to be much more likely you're going to get better outcomes in decision making than if you just say try to market to 1,000 different people that have no interest in the actual product but maybe care just about the profits, which also kind of relates to the fact of where crypto and science can sometimes be a bit misaligned because of the different motives, where crypto is kind of more financially focused, but where DeSci tries to be more scientific focused. That trying to kind of bridge the gap there. So I think it's also why you really need to try to get and align the community and not just focus on just getting anyone that maybe just put some money in but don't actually really care about what you're doing. And of course, it can be avoided in crypto, and I don't think it's a bad thing per se. It's just like that you have the majority being aligned, I think is a pretty important thing. And I think that's where communication amongst the DAO members and the organization is key to really achieving that. And of course, results too.
Yes, and I'm glad you're thinking about this in terms of the importance of alignment and making sure that the incentives of the players within the system are correct or desirable. Since we last spoke, and we did devote about the last 10 minutes of our previous salon on governance questions, have you had any additional thoughts about what might be some good approaches for achieving that kind of alignment?
Yeah. So regarding governance, I think there's no really perfect system, unfortunately, when it comes down to it. But I think again, that's really where like aligning the incentives towards the stakeholders is kind of really key in achieving this. And it's interesting because we talked with some governance people that actually have done research on this for decades, and they actually were talking to us about the fact that a big group of people that are voting on something, they tend to make better collective decision making than having, say, 10 people, even experts, voting on the same thing, which is quite interesting. So I think that's kind of showcases how then distributing control and letting anyone able to give their thoughts and discuss them directly is very important. I think also that's what we're trying to do with our tokenomics, which I think is also key to really create a strong DAO model and community and incentives moving forward. And that's why we've been thinking about that a lot as kind of a key way of achieving aligned incentives all around the organization, both short-term and long-term.
Yes, thank you.
I feel like it's sort of an interesting thing with human psychology too, is corporate governance or any organizational governance. Like that's why the proxy vote was developed, right? Is because people just don't vote. And this is something that every DAO across every area in crypto has been struggling with, is how to get people to vote. So yeah, that's actually a really big topic of discussion. And I've seen a lot of things from like sending messages to the wallet to actually like giving people financial incentives to vote.
Yes, and this is a more broadly applicable question too, because, for instance, an organization like the U.S. Transhumanist Party, which is not a DAO, does hold votes of its members every so often. And we have 4,600 members right now. I'm happy if we can get 100 of those to vote in one of our elections. And again, it's a question of how do you reach them? How do you motivate them to take the time? Because it does take some time to understand the issues or even open the voting form and indicate one's selection. I think if the votes are simpler, then people are more inclined to participate. Like if the question is, do you endorse this particular candidate to essentially receive the support of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, yes, no, or abstain, then people are more likely to vote than if it's a ballot of 15 questions where there are many options and you use a ranked choice method to select among the options, even though that's a more personalized way of expressing one's preferences and it gives a lot more agency to the voter to decide what they're voting on, but then they really have to care about the issues in question and they really have to want to provide their input. And we also want to make sure that in that case, the voting isn't dominated just by a small handful of members who may be interested. We really do want the broad participation of the membership as a whole to make sure the voting is representative of their preferences. So I mention this because this is a set of issues that we are also dealing with. And you pointed out the concept of the proxy vote in corporations as commonly being used to overcome this, but then you have to trust the person to whom you give your proxies, and you have to make sure that that is a person who will truly represent the wishes of the shareholders. And it's a question sometimes in corporations. I own some dividend paying stocks, not a whole lot relative to, say, any major investor, but sometimes I will get notifications of board meetings where shareholders get to vote on something. But usually that which is being voted on is a fairly complex proposal, and I don't have that many shares. So I don't have as much of an incentive to really delve into the issues or the questions. If I had more time, I might do it just because it might be interesting. But I see these dilemmas both from the standpoint of somebody who is organizing votes and somebody who might be asked to vote from time to time. So these are definitely interesting areas to think about. And ideally, of course, if somebody has voting power, they should be motivated to use it. And how to get that to happen is the big challenge. But go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because it's interesting because I've been thinking about this quite a lot as well, and I think this is, as you kind of allude to, is the fact where there have to be a strong enough incentive to want to even dive into that given proposal, and that's also why I really want to distribute control to the community. So there's a lot of DAOs that are quite centralized with control and tokens and all that, and we try to distribute control as much as we possibly can, even from the beginning, or we actually distribute like 30% through the initial funding rounds we have. And then we also give community awards like airdrops and different other things to distribute control even more. So actually we have the community like owning more than like the internal treasury contributors and everything else would actually own. And I think that's where you see if people are actually able to have a significant amount of votes, they'll be a lot more interested in actually diving into the given proposal. So I think that matters a lot. And of course, if it's a very complex proposal, that might make it more difficult to actually want to dive in, even with a lot of votes, a lot of tokens, but it's definitely going to help increase that amount. And I think that's a significant thing, because I think it's also why you even see some DAOs that have been in action for many years. You still have very, very small amounts of votes, even like 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 people. And if you have 10,000, 20,000 members or more, it looks a bit strange in a way that you don't have more people voting. So I think that's where you don't give enough incentives like to actually have them vote. So I think that's something we're really trying to also design and emphasize, because we want this to be a community effort, and that comes a lot from initially from the token distribution, which is why I think that's very important that we try to really emphasize and focus on that.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. And it's interesting, you pointed out, even with some long established DAOs, there's still this phenomenon of perhaps a few tens of people actively voting. And this reminds me of the famous iron law of oligarchy. You can read about it on Wikipedia. It was originated by Robert Michels in 1911. So the idea is essentially in any society, in any organization, the natural tendency is for a kind of oligarchic decision-making elite to form, even if the system is nominally democratic. And part of that is just because a minority of people is going to be really interested in something. Like if you have a complex proposal, and sometimes you need to, because what the organization is doing is complex, or the science that it's supporting is complex, then only a certain fraction of people are going to take enough of an interest in it to try to understand it, to try to affect it. But the interesting implication of that is, if you are one of those interested people, if you really care about something, you can become part of the oligarchy, in effect, provided that the system is porous enough that, say, a group of insiders don't control everything. And this is where more decentralized organizations actually offer an advantage, because somebody who is interested, who has good ideas, who wants to be involved, has more of an entry point into being involved. It's not just controlled by a group of people who may have been there from the onset, or may be like part of an exclusive club, an aristocracy, a good old boys network, or whatever the case may be. So this is where I see decentralized science as offering some benefits, including by motivating some people who may be outside of the conventional scientific establishment. Maybe they're interested in the science, maybe they have some original ideas, but perhaps they didn't get the credentials that the conventional scientific establishment considers to be necessary qualifications, but maybe they didn't get those credentials because, to a point that Art Ramon made earlier in our chat, they're just unconventional or nonconformist thinkers. So Art Ramon, I think this is a good opportunity to get your input on the conversation thus far. And if you want to elaborate on that point or something else, please feel free.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify. I mean, it seems DeSci is created to sort of address the bottleneck of interest of big pharma doing research and clinical studies into a certain drug. But once you get to that point, you're going to have the bottleneck of FDA approval. I mean, it is the purpose of Elata Biosciences to get the IP and try to sell it to big pharma and get them to take it through FDA approval, or are you going to also get into the process of fundraising to do that FDA approval?
I think that this comes down to the question on governance, where the community effectively makes that decision. And just to go back to the previous point before I answer that, is I think at some point crypto does have the potential to solve all these problems. I imagine that someday we're going to live in a world where if you're a part of a DAO or an on-chain organization, when there's a new proposal that is ready to vote on, you'll just get a browser notification. You can simply read through and then click yes or no all through your wallet. I think that oftentimes it's the small things that make a big difference, and people don't really want to log on to the voting forum and actually read everything and cast their vote. I see a world in which it'll just be completely seamless. But yeah, to answer that question, Art, it's an interesting thing. Even in the private sector, there have been a lot of business models that have popped up around this exact thing. So there's a company called Royalty Pharma, and they essentially work with drug companies who are undercapitalized and effectively as a private equity company, where they give upfront cash payments in exchange for future royalties on drug sales. And I think that with DeSci, there will be similar concepts to that, where you have all sorts of different licensing models, different agreements. I mean, royalties is a huge that's becoming like a huge source of income for people. I've seen that pop up all over the places in the mining sector too. There's been a lot there. So I think we could inevitably see a world in where these things are just brought to market through joint ventures. I don't think that you have to fully integrate as a DAO. And I don't think that any pharmaceutical company should really be fully integrated anymore, to be completely honest with you. It's just, when you look at the cost of drug development and how rapidly that's increasing, it becomes clearer and clearer that we're sort of transitioning away from a world in which there's FIPCOs, is like, fully integrated pharmaceutical companies, and more is, okay, you just have to sort of pick what your strategy is, and then you figure out how to get it to market later.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And as the DAO becomes financially successful, is that where you would offer the benefits of, say, of buy and burn of the token to increase the price of the token for the people who own it?
Yeah, this is definitely something that we're planning to do as a need by need basis, and of course, again, aligning with the community is a key all around. So if community wants to do that, then we plan to do that. We also have that in our white paper. So that's definitely something that we are thinking to do if there is all around agreement in terms of doing that.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for those responses. We have an interesting conversation in the YouTube chat as well. Daniel Tweed writes, a $20 or so fine for non-voting would work wonders for voter participation. And he points out in Australia, that's the case. The penalty for not voting in New South Wales is a $55 fine. You must respond within 28 days of the issue date of the notice. But I think I personally would prefer carrot type incentives to stick type incentives, especially for private organizations that really don't have the ability to compel participation or penalize individuals. And I wouldn't want my government to be overly punitive either for non-coercive actions. So I would favor a reward for voting as compared to a penalty for not voting. And within a DAO that issues tokens, because the rules of the token generation are essentially up to the DAO to determine, perhaps it could be that a person gets a certain additional amount of tokens for casting their vote. And over time, the people who vote more often will have more tokens. And as a result, they might even have more voting power if, for instance, a quadratic voting system is used and the voting power is at least somewhat proportional to the tokens that one holds. But that's an interesting way of designing a carrot type incentive as opposed to a stick type incentive. Now, I also wanted to bring up the subject of clinical trials because this was touched on earlier in the salon, and one of the comments made was that successfully getting a drug to clinical trials that was originated via a DeSci approach could lead more people to notice and place more credence in decentralized science. And Ben had shared an article previously by Reason of fightaging.org entitled "The Clinical Trial Abundance Proposals Seem Too Little to Lead to Meaningful Change." And generally that article discusses ways to potentially reduce the cost and the time expenditure of clinical trials. But Ben, I wonder if you would like to go into greater detail into what was discussed in that article, as well as relevant questions for our guests stemming from that.
Oh, this is speaking more off the cuff than I'm comfortable. I'll try to do a little bit, and then I'll just go into my question. But in the article, Reason does talk about how the GMP, the Good Manufacturing Practices world, is like more expensive than it needs to be for getting drugs to market. And I am firmly working in that very kind of role. I test drugs by GMP to make sure that they last as long as they are supposed to, that they are manufactured correctly. So I'm really hesitant to say a ton about that exactly. It would be nice if drugs could get to market quicker and cheaper and still be safe. I am pretty with the term invisible graveyard of how many lives are being lost because we're not getting drugs to market faster than the opposite of that. We're making drugs so safe that we don't lose any lives because of them getting to market inappropriately. I feel that difference between the two is pretty large. I will shut my mouth in the speaking off the cuff and just kind of say that that article by Reason, I did wonder what kind of possibilities you saw for DeSci being able to address some of Reason's concerns.
I think that specifically speaking on the matter of psychiatry is it's been very difficult to screen and vet patients. So you just have these huge cohorts of people, and it's very heterogeneous, right? It's a great thing that you're bringing up, really, because I couldn't agree more. It's clinical trials and trial design is actually probably the most important and the hardest thing anywhere in pharmaceuticals, just because of the amount of paperwork that has to be done, the times, the requirements, depending on the regulatory body you're filing with. And yeah, I mean, I feel as though there's probably a lot of stuff that works very well that doesn't actually get to market because of poor trial design. I think that with DeSci, it really just comes in to incentives. The sooner that there can be an organized framework for implementing a decentralized trial, which is a big topic anywhere in clinical medicine. Once there's an organized framework for doing that, you can sort of start to collect data that will help you screen patients more effectively and get more homogeneous patient groups in one place, which would have it would be the predictability of trial success would be much higher if that was able to happen.
Yes, thank you for that response. And of course, a DAO by itself cannot alter FDA regulatory policy as such. But do you think through decentralized science organizations, it might be possible to essentially expedite certain aspects of clinical trials on the front end, even if they have to pass through the same FDA review criteria, somehow getting together the patients or the resources to conduct the clinical trials, or developing more expedited protocols where the FDA might offer some flexibility would be feasible through a DAO?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people, it's really easy to blame the FDA for a lot of for why drugs don't get approved, but they have their reasons for why they set certain legislation, of course, but or rather enforce it. But I would say that when it comes to a DAO, there can be a certain amount of collaboration with the FDA through experimental medicine. I think that they do give more credit to that than people like to assume. Whereas if you have a whole population of people trying a certain medicine, even though there might be a lack of official documentation, I think the FDA would be open to working together on maybe setting a fast track approval, which is what we see all around in psychiatry, just because the unmet need is so huge that everything is essentially eligible for fast track approval.
Yes, and it's interesting too. Go ahead, Andreas.
Thank you. No, I just also wanted to mention that, of course, I think the DAO design of having a broad range of individuals can also help to, I think, design these different trials faster. And I think even an interesting thing is as was kind of alluded to, of having DAO participants, but potentially being able to participate in these clinical trials, like having that as kind of a recruitment platform in a way, where they could potentially get rewarded from the DAO from actually participating in a clinical trial, for instance. And also, just if you have a broad range of individuals from biotech, pharma, academia, patients, and you have that combination, and they are really interested in these potential treatments, I think you can really much easier find potential treatments, and also like streamline these details to a much faster degree, because you have much better expertise collectively than you would have in a traditional organization. So I think those are quite strong points as well of a DAO. If you build a really strong community where you can utilize that in quite many significant ways.
Yes, thank you. And the interesting observation that I have heard from many people who have interacted with the FDA is that the FDA staff, the ones who are reviewing applications for new medicines, they're not opposed generally to the approval of new medicines, and they don't really see themselves as intentionally slowing down innovation. Many of them would actually be interested in seeing some of these proposals succeed. The problems are not really at that level, at what individual reviewers do. The problems are with obsolete laws, processes, bad or misaligned incentives that sometimes those reviewers have to work within. And of course, sometimes the FDA, just like many government agencies, is just understaffed. So people may even be trying their best to review applications, but there aren't enough reviewers, and there's a slowdown as a result of that. But we held an extensive panel on FDA reform in April of 2021 that I would encourage everyone to watch. I do think, though, that there are incentives that could be different and policies that would affect the workings of the FDA that could be better configured to expedite the approval of medications, or even allow certain medications not to pass through certain kinds of clinical trials. And the distinction between phase 1 and 2 clinical trials and phase 3 clinical trials, which are the most extensive for efficacy, comes to mind here. So along these lines, Alan wonders what forms of legislation could benefit the DAO or DeSci model over traditional business structures. Since we are a political party, I'm curious what your thoughts are about policy reforms that could help the DeSci model gain a foothold and perhaps even have an easier time interacting with regulatory agencies such as the FDA.
Well, aside from direct interaction with the regulatory agency, I would say more so is just there really needs to be a clear regulatory framework for crypto. Because if you can get that down, you can align the incentives much better. And the arrival of Wall Street and other things like that, that would really help push everything forward. I think that's probably step one before talking about anything on the FDA level specifically.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think yeah, to that point, I think as kind of alluded to before, also with the fact of like an IP, NFT, or IPT being able to be deemed as security is an issue that makes DeSci a bit harder to actually come to life in the end, or have completely aligned incentives. And I think, yeah, overall the security risk of tokens makes it a bit difficult also for the design, which is also why people in crypto and DeSci world are spending a lot of time to really try to find ways of structuring the tokenomics and what to say and not to say, because they're afraid of legal scrutiny. I do hope, and I do think there's potential of the upcoming administration to make some of these things easier and to make some legislation more favorable, both from a health standpoint and also from a crypto standpoint and other aspects. And I hope that's going to happen. I guess we'll see. But yeah, I think there are definitely some over legislation in some aspects and lack of legislation in some other aspects, and makes some things a bit harder to do and a bit slower than otherwise should be. And I think getting safe and effective treatments to patients as fast as possible, I think should be absolutely prioritized. And I hope we can see some even more favorable aspects in that front moving forward.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. And actually, Daniel Tweet, our 2024 US vice presidential candidate, had this question: do you foresee 4 upcoming years of a pro-crypto regulatory environment? It seems you expressed some optimism in that regard. Do you have any, let's say, anticipations of what is likely to happen there in terms of changes to crypto policy? I know that for some time now, at least de facto, the US federal government has treated cryptocurrency assets as securities. So if you file your tax return in the United States, for instance, and you sell any cryptocurrency with a gain, you report that as a capital gain on your tax return. And I wonder, do you think that's going to change in some way? Crypto taxation is overly complicated at this point. That is my personal view. And I think that could be a disincentive to a lot of people to be involved in cryptocurrency markets. What could be done to make that easier?
Yeah, and I think that's like a global thing broadly, that it's very difficult to, I think, track all these things and have proper frameworks. And so I think one of the biggest issues is just how much scrutiny there has been overall regarding crypto. So I think even just for that to disappear, that scrutiny would be a huge step forward. So how much better things will be regarding legal changes overall, I don't know how much is going to happen on that front. It's hard to say. And before administration starts, it's hard to make predictions because, of course, some things are more marketing than actually real stuff. So I guess we'll have to see. But in terms of the scrutiny, I think it's gonna be much less. And I think the overall administration seems to be a lot more pro crypto. So I think there's a lot of promise. But yeah, we'll ultimately have to see how much is more marketing than actually plans that will end up being put forward in the end.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And it does seem to me that perhaps there might be less enforcement of certain interpretations of how conventional regulations apply to cryptocurrencies with the upcoming administration. This was a real difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in the previous election, in that for whatever reason, the Democratic Party establishment took a pretty hardline anti-cryptocurrency stance. And then, of course, that led to the consequence of a lot of the crypto entrepreneurs deciding to support Donald Trump, and that may even have pushed Donald Trump over the edge, though, of course, there are a lot of hypotheses over what led to that outcome. But nonetheless, I do think lighter crypto regulation and lighter attempts to put cryptocurrency into the predefined boxes, categories for previously existing assets like securities would be beneficial, because cryptocurrency is really different and it's really innovative, and you can have structures built on top of blockchains that don't really resemble conventional assets and certainly don't resemble shares in a corporation. Now, I also wanted to ask you this question. What proofs of concept either already exist or could be developed soon, again, to highlight the promise of decentralized science? Like, is there something, some way of approaching it that could get a lot of people interested and involved, maybe more motivated to vote as well?
Yeah, I think we really have to focus on the overall scientists' incentives if you want to create more support there. And I think one organization that's doing very well on that front and helping to get more people involved from a scientist perspective is a research hub, which you guys might know about, that is focused on getting, or actually now they're actually building a new journal, a decentralized journal. But before, it's been focused on actually paying people for doing peer review on different studies, and normally they don't get paid for it at all. And it's kind of been, I think, a thing among scientists that where many have not really understood why they have to put all this time into this and not get paid anything for it. And you're seeing this explosion of research actually getting involved and getting in, actually earning some money on peer review. And I think they're earning $350 from one peer review. And I remember there was even the guy from Brazil that did one review, and it was more than his whole monthly salary in Brazil, which also shows how, like, for him, it was a huge deal, even just from a financial standpoint, that like him contributing to science could actually give him more than he earned in his traditional job. So I think products and services that are really aligned with what scientists they want and have sought are really going to be critical on that end. And of course, I think overall, like, funding mechanisms is a very promising item there, where there are many scientists that spend a lot of time and have a hard time getting grants and getting funding for their research. And sometimes because it's too risky, sometimes it's because there's so much competition. And even from a time standpoint, sometimes that even means that they have to let go of their research because they simply don't have the funds to keep working on it, even if it's very promising. So there's a lot of research that just go to waste, even though it could potentially be very promising and helpful for patients. So I think like, yeah, really thinking about what products and services and assistance that researchers, scientists really are interested in and seek, and what they're lacking. And I think that's really what we need to think about and focus on. I think some of these are some of the most promising aspects to achieve that, and already helping to get more adoption in the space.
Yes, thank you very much. And Research Hub does indeed look quite promising. Getting paid for peer review, of course, incentivizes more peer reviews to happen more rapidly. And furthermore, it allows truly meritorious science to actually be published, because sometimes in certain situations with particular journals or with particular institutions, there's a bias among the peer reviewers, like certain, especially smaller sub-communities of scientists could have their pet theories or their, let's say, favorite circle of associates, and they're going to overly scrutinize or be biased against anyone outside of their little circle or anything that might challenge their pet theories. But a bigger problem with peer review, and this was one that I encountered myself when I actually got a peer-reviewed paper in economics published as a college student, but it took a bit over 2 years from the time I submitted the paper to the time I received the feedback from the peer reviewers, and then I made the changes, and there was a bit of a gap between when I made the changes and the ultimate publication of the article. And the substance of that peer review was fine. I didn't have any issues with the nature of the comments that were made or the changes that I had to make to that paper, but I realized the time lag was so extreme that it completely defeated the purpose of anything that I would have wanted to communicate in an official scientific publication, because my time frame for communicating new ideas is perhaps a week or a month at most. It is not 2 years. And I realized if I were to pursue the post-undergraduate academic path, then there would be this huge lag between when I would originate ideas and when I would be essentially allowed to communicate them. And this wasn't the only reason why I chose not to pursue a PhD, but it was one of them. And I wonder how many other people are affected by that. By the way, my most popular YouTube video, still to this day, is my video from January of 2011, so 14 years ago now, entitled Reasons Not to Pursue a PhD. And there's a reason why it's popular. But if we want to incentivize more science, more research happening, we need to figure out how to overcome those barriers. So I really like Research Hub. I really like the idea of paying people for scientific work that they do. Obviously, incentives matter. You pay for additional work, then additional work is going to happen. So now I wanted to come back to Zach and see if you had any additional questions or observations based on the conversation thus far.
Thank you, Gennady. I am interested in this startup city in Honduras called Prospera. There's sort of a subsegment of it called Vitalia that is explicitly looking for, I guess, like clinical trials that are, you know, outside of the realms of what's legally permissible. I think everybody there has quite a lot of money if they're moving to a private city. I'm wondering if it might be worth some like advertising efforts to try and promote yourselves there. I'm part of a Telegram group that has a decent amount of them in there. I could send you a link to, but yeah, it seems like they're looking for clinical trials for outside of the realms of legislation. That might be a good place to do that, because then if you get something approved there, they've got sort of a system like contracts that go there. You could almost get it approved just via whatever their regulations are, and then deal with medical tourism to be able to get something awesome. Although I guess you'd have to have something pretty dang revolutionary to get people to come there. But that was just a thought that came to mind.
Yeah, thank you. We actually have been in contact with quite a few people from Vitalia, including Nicholas Ansinger, who's heading that. And yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I think there's definitely potential of collaboration in the future with them. Yeah, like we're definitely open to that, and we'll see what happens. And I think it's very interesting what they're doing, and there is some quite fascinating treatments and focuses that are happening down there. I appreciate you bringing that up, and we'll definitely
awesome.
Excellent. Well, hopefully we'll see some more collaborations arise, including in experimental cities such as Vitalia. The biggest risk I see now to Vitalia is the current administration in Honduras of President Xiomara Castro, who is a hardline socialist and wants to abolish all of these special economic zones. So I'm a bit concerned about that, but I'm hoping that through a variety of, let's say, legal actions, Prospera might be able to withstand this onslaught. Rich Lee points out in our chat that he is a Vitalian, so he is over there. So thank you, Rich, for that comment. And if you have any insight on the regulatory situation there or some of the threats and how they might be overcome, please feel free to share. But I do hope that there will be more zones or autonomous cities or even areas within countries whose governments are more open to that kind of experimentation, where clinical trials could happen more rapidly, where there could be experiments with even drug discovery and development and manufacturing eventually, so that there could be faster processes than the US FDA currently permits. Rich does say that Vitalia is a great place for clinical trials, so that is something to consider. And Josh Universe also points out he is a Vitalian resident, but he lives in Florida, so it's possible to be a resident but not be physically present over there. So that is interesting as well. Now, I also wanted to ask Ben Ballweg if he had any further questions.
Namkhai, us USTPers have been interacting with Andreas over the years and kind of know who he is, where he's coming from, etc. You're a little bit of a newer entity to us. Any chance you could tell us more about yourself, where you're coming from, how you met Andreas, etc., etc.? Hot seat?
Hot seat indeed, yeah. I met Andreas over a year ago. We met on Discord. My background is mainly around healthcare entrepreneurship, ad tech in the healthcare industry. And then a while back, even before that, I started a healthcare journal. I've been into crypto for quite a while too. So that's like the most succinct version I could possibly give.
All right, thank you. So that gives us a bit more knowledge of your background, and certainly your skill set is greatly needed in our community. Healthcare entrepreneurs, innovators, people who know how to market healthcare products are very important to advancing the kinds of treatments and the future of personalized medicine that we care about. So now let's go to Alan Crowley. Any questions or comments from you?
No, I'm glad to hear what you're working on. Hear about what you're working on. I think this idea of tailoring pharmaceuticals for for mental health is a great idea. So carry on.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Alan. And Rich Lee has another comment. He says he does have a lot of insight. He's very optimistic despite the current political issues. So thank you for that observation, Rich. And now I also wanted to ask Art Ramon if he has further questions or comments.
Yeah, I think last time I asked you or made the comment that, with economic singularity, rushing up on us, that, the people are going to need some happy drugs. So I don't remember what you said in response to that. But yeah, I mean, people losing their jobs, cheap, happy drugs. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because this is something that I actually was kind of thinking about recently. How that I think that there should be a lot of support for transhumanists and futurists and people in longevity on mood disorders, because if they were going to live for hundreds of years more, or even more than that, there are going to be times where things can be challenging or difficult, and maybe you can get in a rut or whatever happens. I think it's important to have treatments that can work very safely and very fast for any potential things that happen. And also just say if we reach a point where we can choose when we want to end our lives, and then there might be a phase where someone goes through a very tough period and they might choose to do it if there's no proper treatment to actually get out of that, because like tough moments happen to anyone, and sometimes it can be too much at once, and you have to find a way to get out of that, and maybe you don't have the support system or find a proper way to do it, or whatever the issue is, and then it's very helpful to have something that actually works as quickly as possible. So I think even just for continuing to enjoy your life for longer, and if it's for hundreds or thousands of years, how long you want to choose, I think it's very important to have something that can keep you in a positive state and make you keep enjoying your life as much as you possibly can. So I think, to me, they kind of should go together, because it's like quality and quantity, they work best together.
Yeah, I had seen the Brave New World a few months back, and I hadn't actually read the book or seen the movie before. I was like, oh, okay, so that's what they're talking about. How they're just popping pills to cope with minor ordeals. That's not what I'm looking for. I mean, it's to just not have to deal with severe depression. How it brings you down. I think I might have mentioned that I deal with some long COVID issues. I think that causes me some depression, but I take a few pills, and I try not to worry with that depression that's kind of brought on by the COVID fatigue. So the Brave New World, they excessively pop pills to always be in a super elated, happy state. But to me, it's not to be in that super happy state, just to not deal with the negative parts of depression.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that's the point too, of achieving a solid baseline. because if it gets to be happy all the time, then it's more I guess artificially induced, and I think also good times and bad times, they teach you different things and they make you enjoy life more. If everything is always the same, I think it's hard to really appreciate life eventually. So I think you have to do things that are difficult and have tough moments to then enjoy the ones that are good. And it's more if something happens consecutively, it can be really hard to deal with that. And then I think it's why it can be really helpful to have some solutions there. And on that note, I'm sorry to hear about your issues with long COVID. Actually, there is a new DAO being launched, I think this month also, long COVID labs, focused on finding new solutions for long COVID. So if you haven't seen that, it might actually be interesting to check them out. Just a note.
Yeah, I'll check that out. Yeah, I mean, I've run into people who are super happy, and they always seem to be dentists. So I was like, whoa, they're just beaming super happiness. It's a little off-putting.
It's just because their teeth are so good when they're smiling at you, man.
It's always dentists that I've always run into these people. But the long COVID sucks, but I found a few solutions going to a long COVID therapist, kind of behavioral modification. One of the things I did try that did help is taking a lot of electrolytes. I take almost $150 worth of monthly of electrolytes. That's been helping. So, thank you.
Yes, and I think a decentralized science approach toward long COVID is particularly promising because long COVID is not a singular condition. It varies dramatically among patients, more so than any other disease that I'm aware of, because COVID does so many different types of damage throughout the body, and it depends on, for instance, which organs or which systems of the body the virus particularly infiltrated and wreaked havoc on, whether there was organ damage or not, because some long COVID conditions occur without any organ damage. They just dysregulate the autonomic nervous system. That is what happened to me for a year, and I essentially had to find a way to re-regulate my autonomic nervous system through graded exercise, but it worked in my situation. There's an article that was published in November 2024 called Long COVID Labs is Accelerating a Cure on Chain. So those who are interested in long COVID labs can find out about it from that article, and hopefully there will be more published in this regard, because certainly mainstream institutions have essentially completely ignored long COVID at this point. There were some early attempts, some studies about what could potentially be effective in combating long COVID. Unfortunately, because of recent political shifts, it has been decided for the culture as a whole to completely disregard the toll of COVID, and many people just prefer to ignore it or to politicize it or even to blame the patients for it in some regards. And that is not a productive approach at all. We need actual cures for long COVID and the many different types of long COVID that exist, because the same treatment will not work for everyone. So
I just want to mention on that point that the founder, he actually treated his own long COVID through a mix of antivirals, and I think they're also going to launch some early studies in the coming few months also. So it's going to be very interesting to see if they can actually help the patients there, because it's there's kind of a huge community of people having really severe detrimental effects from long COVID. So I think seeing these people help could be amazing, because it's a big issue for more than 100 million people. So it's definitely something that, as you also mentioned, has to be targeted, and is urgently needed when there is not really any funding for it at all.
Yes, absolutely. And the toll that this condition has taken is tremendous. As you mentioned, hundreds of millions of people. have long COVID symptoms, including some people who don't realize it. Because, for instance, the way in which I realized it was because I'm a frequent runner, and the long COVID definitely affected my running for the first 6 months when I had the condition, and then I kind of gradually worked my way out of that. But if I had been more sedentary and I didn't know what normal exercise felt like, I might have just been, let's say, trying to exercise and thinking, well, this is normal. This is just how being active feels, which is definitely not the case. But I also wanted to ask you, essentially, with regard to your expectations for the rest of this year, 2025, as well as where you think decentralized science will progress by the end of this decade. And you can speak to your plans for Elata Biosciences for the current year, as well as how you think the field will advance during the next year, because progress has been quite rapid thus far. And then where will we be 5 years from now in 2030?
So for us, I'll just start by answering that question. We are planning on making a few announcements on projects that we want to get to right to work on in the coming months. So stay tuned for that. As far as it goes with the next decade, I think that there does need to be more de-risking put in place throughout DeSci. I mean, science alone, without any, just as it is so prone to failure. Any technology development, really. So the sooner that there can be a sort of transition away, because when I look out, most of what I see is very much so moonshot projects, which is cool. I mean, I have no problem with that, but I think in terms of the economic sustainability, I just wonder how that's going to work. Because when you look at a big pharma company, they have a very diversified research portfolio. They have stuff in there that's very high risk, and they have stuff in there that's really low risk, and they can sort of hedge using that. I think that's inevitably where DeSci needs to go. It needs to move into de-risking, and it needs to put more emphasis on clinically validated drugs and clinically validated research, right? There needs to be that element present to sort of ensure future success.
Can I ask, is there a reason you guys decided to focus on psychiatric realm of research specifically, rather than just say, oh, we're doing everything? Is it just to kind of help specialize, or what was the reason for selecting particularly that area of focus?
I would say that because this is one of the areas in all of pharmaceuticals where there is just so much unmet need. Maybe besides neurology, I can't think of anywhere where there's more unmet need than this. I mean, this field has really just suffered from progress so much, and there hasn't been that much innovation in the past 50 years. There's just been very little. So it's an important thing. And also, I think there is that issue where pharma has just completely divested. They've just really gone away and stopped putting effort into making progress here, despite the fact that, me and Andreas, as well as a ton of other people, we would say that there is a sort of ripeness for innovation here where progress can be made at a faster pace. Despite what some people may think, there is that sort of variance of opinions there. But I would say that was the main reason, as well as just I think everyone here knows so many people that suffer with mental health disorders. There's no way us and everyone else looking at this doesn't know someone, if not they themselves, are suffering from some sort of mental disorder. So having that, as well as the lack of progress, I think that justifies this. And neuropsychiatry really needs its own DAO. It needs its own project.
So yeah, I think that's amazing what you're doing. I'm sort of interested. I use a service called sequencing.com, which unlike 23andMe or Ancestry.com that just does a little bit, it's full next gen sequencing of your DNA and exploring some of the SNPs, or the single nucleotide polymorphisms, where a couple of my alleles are changed in the DNA. I have quite a few that are related to Parkinson's disease. So I'm wondering if there's any what's the term? Any space in your guys's plan to be able to look at preventive mechanisms for mental health disorders, because I think we see a lot of it with young people, but we also see a lot of it with old people. And it'd be kind of cool if someone maybe could perhaps present you their genetics and be able to say, okay, I clearly, this is coming in the future, or likely to come, and be able to have some sort of therapy that was like targeted towards being able to at least reduce the probability of that outcome.
I would say that overall, neuropsychiatry probably isn't there. We haven't, to be completely honest with you, we haven't put too much thought into that, just because through the research we've done ourselves and the people we've talked to, we've really found that a lot of these psychiatric conditions are deeply polygenic. So you could have, you could have hundreds of different genes contributing to some sort of clinical outcome, right? Whereas I feel as though, in neurology, we're not fully there yet either, but there is a better understanding of what's actually happening upstream from maybe the specific circuitry.
I believe we don't have Gennady yet. He's still working on reconnecting. I agree with what you're saying. I think one thing that sort of comes to my mind is Alzheimer's. Maybe the mechanism for that is, I think, it's still sort of unknown, but we know it has to do with like the tangles related to like the plaque formation in the brain. And I wonder if, when we're talking about with your project focusing on like tailored medicine or specific medicine, if with the understanding that this is a polygenic, that a lot of disorders are, is there any room for people to at least have, as part of the data in these trials, be able to submit their own genetics, so we could perhaps start gathering data to be able to say, okay, maybe yes, it's polygenic, but over time we have developed sort of an understanding of this? Or would that be too like complicated and add complexity that wouldn't necessarily contribute to the efficacy of the operation? Like genetics in general, any room for that where you're thinking of?
Yeah, certainly down the line there is. I think in the more short to medium term, there just needs to be more emphasis put on circuitry, on EEG, on fMRI, on that sort of stuff, is we have to understand what's happening more so in the brain. And then later down the line, that's certainly a possibility. Of there have been a couple studies on CRISPR and gene editing for mental health disorders, but the data is still not that good, and there's just not that much of an understanding.
Or which disorders? Because that sounds really interesting.
There were a few. I think one of them was just major depression. A lot of these studies, they still focus on the DSM criteria of what these look like, but it was major depression, I believe.
It stands out to me that if needing to use fMRI would be an important part of the diagnostic process, that might become a bottleneck in your operations, considering a lot of those are in hospitals, and that would be very expensive to individually purchase one of these for each person in the trial. Or how would you how would you visualize being able to obtain the diagnostics that you require to be able to, for example, as you say, get into the neural circuitry? Because it seems like that'd be, there's huge capital equipment going in there that would be sort of expensive to utilize.
Yeah, so interesting question. There has been, just to sort of on a side note, there has been this emergence of this of like platform-based companies in neuropsychiatry using machine learning to take a ton of different diagnostic modalities and then sort of crunch them up and create like a standardized way of diagnosing these things based on a lot of different things. I would say that a lot of it really over time building it out relies on wearables getting better. At-home wearables, I believe, will certainly play a major role into the improvement of mental health disorders. We've seen a good amount with EEG. fMRI is, it seems a bit trickier with regards to that, but I expect that there will be. It won't just sort of be like one pathway, one molecule. I don't think it'll be that. It'll be a lot of different.
Do you see wearable EEGs as something that might be coming to the market? Because it seems like, I mean, I even have an Aura ring, which is, I think there's a new one coming out now that I really want to get, but the one I have is currently like pretty much a great standard for where you want to be for measuring a lot of your biometrics. But as you mentioned, if it's something like an EEG, wouldn't that require a whole new wearable being developed first, or is there something like that on the market that I'm unaware of?
There's already stuff like that on the market. I think the how reliable these things are is pretty questionable, but there is this. It's called I think it's called WIoT or MIoT, is medical Internet of Things. So just all these different devices and at-home wearables, they're becoming a lot more. There's a few popular ones. I wish I could give you names. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but if you're interested in finding out more, I would just do a quick Google search of at-home EEG. That there's a few devices that you can use.
That'd be pretty neat. So medical Internet of Things, that's interesting, having everything connect together and be able to sort of have a centralized platform, because I've got so many different biometrics things. I feel like each one has their own platform they're trying to promote, which is sort of tough when it comes down to it. But I think we've got a few minutes left.
Yes.
Maybe
we have about a minute left, I would say, and my apologies for the camera difficulties, but thankfully I've been able to get back on. And thank you, Zach, for carrying on this conversation. I do want to offer our guests the opportunity to say some final remarks in about the last minute of our salon. And thank you so much for joining us and updating us on the progress of Elata Biosciences as well as DeSci more generally. So what would you like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you so much for the chance to talk to you guys again and update on everything that happened. I think it's been a very interesting conversation, and I think I've got a lot of interesting thoughts and ideas from all this, which is what I hoped. So I'm very glad. And yeah, I'm really excited for us to build this out and really build some better solutions for patients. I think it's more needed than ever, and I'm really excited to start funding the first projects, and hopefully we can get the first project going in the next few months. That's would be really big, and also for DeSci overall, I think there's a ton of potential, and we're starting to see things really take off recently, and I think the next years are going to be very interesting in that end as well. So yeah, thank you again, guys, and hope to keep in touch.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas and Namkhai. It was great to have you as our guest as well and learn from your extensive knowledge, as well as find out more about you per Ben's question. And we look forward to seeing what decentralized science can achieve in 2025 and beyond. Thank you for making this a great inaugural salon of this year, and I hope we can all live long and prosper.